one of the last remaining prejudices that's legitimate in our society is a prejudice against the past. And it's true that the past is filled with injustices, but it's also true that we're all products of it. And so I would say, if there's a tendency in our sources, it's that we emphasize primary texts of different kinds, that we don't shy away from texts that are long ago. We all know that traveling to different places is a way to expand your horizons and become less parochial as a person. Well, time travel does that to you too. And since we can't do it, we have to do it through books.
Right, it's my honor to be able to moderate this second panel, which is going to be on the question of civics in the classroom. I'm going to ask each of our panelists today, Bryan Garsten, Michael Clune, and Tetyana Hoggan-Kloubert, to say a few words. I'm Josiah Ober. Everyone calls me Josh, and so you ought to. I teach at Stanford University, where I am the co-director of the Stanford Civics Initiative, and I also sit on the executive committee of the Alliance for Civics in the Academy, which is one of the co-sponsors of this wonderful conference. So let's just go by alphabetical order. Michael, would you like to start us out by just saying a few words about your thoughts on, broadly speaking, the topic of our panel here on the curriculum?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Thank you very much, and thanks to Peter and everyone who's made this fascinating event possible. I was just thinking, with respect to the previous panel and the emphasis on community and the emphasis on creating a kind of porousness between university spaces and community spaces. And in some ways, I think, the opposite can also be true and also be of value. In some ways, I think that one of the greatest ways we can be of value to the community and to the civic order is by not being porous, by representing something that is different from what obtains in the culture and the community. And more, I've thought of I think of the kind of teaching I do and believe in as countercultural, right? As something that a practice that really is centered on the great books, and reading at a time of all kinds of attentional challenges, on great works of enduring value at a time of a kind of populist and otherwise suspicion of greatness, enduring value, and the tradition. All of these things, and so that. What I would say a kind of countercultural dimension of civics education is something that interests me. I spent 20 years in English departments at Case Western Reserve, University of Michigan, and elsewhere before coming to the Chase Center at Ohio State University this last fall. And I was motivated in part by the sense I had of my own home discipline of English as becoming in many ways indistinguishable from other disciplines, indistinguishable from the kinds of things you would hear or on NPR or read in the New York Times and so forth, and excited by the possibility of sort of renewing the education as really focused on reading, thinking about, discussing great works of literature. In my case, is obviously what I'm most familiar with, but philosophy, political philosophy, history, and so forth. So that's sort of some of the thoughts, and it was inspired again and again. I don't think, not against community engagement in any way. I think both things can be true. I think there's ways in moments of thinking about that porousness that the panel before us was describing, but also thinking of a value of creating that difference. And as Peter said in his opening remarks, and something I agree with, the civic kind of education movement I see as many ways motivated by a sense of what's wrong, and what's wrong in higher education, what's wrong in our current culture. And I find that, paradoxically perhaps, the source of the greatest public enthusiasm for what we're doing. When I go and talk to people in various, whether it's at schools or giving readings or interviews on NPR and places like that, people are interested when I say, hey, I'm interested in doing something that most people are not doing and wish they were doing more of, spending time with great work. So just a few thoughts.
Terrific. Thank you. Bryan, Bryan Garsten, our second panelist?
Sure. Well, again, thanks to Peter for inviting me to what is really a pluralistic space. It's amazing to have so many different kinds of organizations here, and I'm grateful to be a part of it. I want to say just a few words, actually, on a very similar theme. The classroom as a civic resource. Each of us in our own lives knows that we have moments of busyness when our attention is focused on practical matters, and then moments when we need to step back, take a walk, talk with friends, be thoughtful about a big decision or important matters in our lives. And in society, it's like that too. We live in a very practical society. America's famously a practical place. But it's crucial that we have spaces and times for reflection. And universities, as I see it, really, that's part of their role, is to provide this time and space for thoughtfulness. And where that happens, well, most obviously, but most challengingly today, is the classroom. It seems to us in our work at Yale that classrooms, especially the small seminar classroom, the discussion classroom, is really facing a set of formidable challenges at the moment. We all know about the challenge of reading, especially reading difficult works. It's so tempting to read the summaries instead. Speaking openly and experimentally in an age when students tell us they feel the classroom is a performative space, and so they feel as though they're often performing maybe for the professor, but also for one another, especially, and that constrains what they feel like they can explore, their ability to try out an idea, hear it analyzed, and then change their mind about it. But the classroom is also a place that holds enormous potential. It's a small-scale space, and small changes in how we run classrooms can have immediate gratifying effects. They are places you can create trust and build real connections. And our thought is that just having that experience can be transformative for students, that many of them are longing for that experience without realizing it. And once they have it, they want more of it. And we at the Center for Civic Thought at Yale actually focus on spaces outside the formal curriculum first. So we try to create a whole world on campus, a whole ecosystem of informal reading groups, guest seminars, we call them dinner forums. We have all different formats, which I could discuss if anyone's interested, designed to encourage a certain type of in-depth, serious conversation, usually about a text and a guest. And the idea is to create demand for a certain kind of conversation. And then over time, that demand seeps into the formal classroom too. People come, students come, faculty come to expect and want that kind of engagement. And then in our work in New Haven, which is also central to our center, there we actually focus the formal classroom because it seems that's our comparative advantage in New Haven. That's what we as Yale have to offer. And so the oldest part of our center is actually called the Citizens, Thinkers, Writers program. We have a former undergraduate mentor here in the room who's a part of that program, but we work with New Haven high schoolers, especially those trying to be first gen to go to college, on an intense program of morning classroom experiences and then afternoon experiences in New Haven and with New Haven leaders. So they may be reading Plato in the morning on justice and then asking the mayor or the chief of police, how they understand justice, which is a pretty amazing thing to watch. But we try to have that back and forth and build an expectation that this is a normal thing to do, that is to dive into practice and step back and reflect deeply about it with the help of fundamental texts of different kinds. So I'm happy to say anything more about it as the conversation goes on, but I did want to foreground just the kind of core function of universities, which I think we can often take for granted, which is providing time, space for thinking, and the example of what thoughtfulness and conversation is.
Thank you. And Tetyana Hoggan-Kloubert, joining us from the University of Augsburg.
Yeah, Augsburg is in Bavaria, in Germany, and you would probably wonder why a German experience can be helpful here, talking about curriculum. And I would even make it more complicated. I'm originally from Ukraine, so I have Ukrainian-German perspective that I would try to connect somehow with American one, and I don't know if it will be of any help, but let us try. So. The topic of this panel, curriculum, I was wondering how I would interpret this, and I would say it's what we learn, how we learn, and why we learn. And then I would say when we talk about civics and democracies, all democracies have their pasts. And this past was not necessarily a glorious one. And that's probably my entry point, me coming from or being born in a totalitarian regime of Soviet Union. I know the alternative to democracy, and when I teach and learn about democracy, I always have in mind what would be the alternative, and this is an authoritarian regime and totalitarianism. And that's probably put the whole teaching and learning about civics and democracy in a perspective that is not abstract, it's not 200 years ago. A perspective that was, for me, the reality of the 11 years of my life. Yeah, you would say probably not enough, 11, but also for people like me, for my parents, for my grandparents, the reality of life. Also after that. So how do we make this transition from totalitarian regimes to democracy? How we think about that? How we prevent that there is a relapse? It's important for Ukraine, and it's important, of course, for Germany. Germany is now the place where I'm living and teaching. I'm professor of adult education at the University of Augsburg in Germany. And when I talk about curricular, I always talk also with my students about the past in Ukraine and past in Germany, of course. This is another topic. Augsburg is situated in the triangle, if you want, between Dachau, the concentration camp of Dachau, and Nuremberg, with, first of all, Nuremberger laws, but also Nuremberger trial. And so thinking about curricular in civics means also to be aware what's here, to be aware of traditions, to be aware of places, of spaces, of sites, of narratives that are there. And probably another one point that I will be talking about here in this panel, just to announce, so past is the first one, the second one would be, I live in the city that in Germany is a city with the most amount of migrants. We call it person with migrant background. We are 51% in Augsburg. We are the majority in Augsburg, and we are very happy of that to be a majority. And it is a city, the second safest city in the whole Germany. So if somebody will tell you migrants can cause problems, just send them to me. I will talk with them about the example of Augsburg. So, and what I connect this with democracy is that democracy is plural, diverse, with people coming from whatever places we all come from, carrying our backpacks with us. And it's important to acknowledge this. It's important to have spaces, curricular designs, so that they allow for diversity, that they encourage this. Because my second thought is, in principle, we all are migrants. We migrate between cultures, context, traditions. and to acknowledge this in the curricular is also one of my mission, if you want.
Terrific, thank you. And I think Tetyana has reminded us that when we talk about citizenship, we, I think, usually are talking about citizenship in a democratic community of one sort or another, and I want to come back to that in a little bit. But before we do that, of course, when we think about civics and civics in higher education, it means many things to different people, and it certainly means experience and dispositions and skills, as well as knowledge. And obviously, per the previous panel, not all of it happens in classrooms, but then a lot of it does. And so we're here to talk about on this panel what happens as in the curriculum, in the classroom, and a lot of what happens in a classroom is going to be about text. It's not all about text, but a lot of it is going to be. And so I want to start out by asking what texts and what kind of texts should we be thinking about some kind of a civics canon, a sort of core text, and if so, are these texts sort of mostly historical? Are they ones that we would immediately identify as sort of things that would be taught, for example, in Columbia's great books curriculum? So I'm just going to ask each of you, is it worthwhile thinking about a civics canon, or should we abandon the idea? If we do think about it, what kind of text should we be thinking about? What kind of genre belong in there? Is there a role for fiction, for memoir? Michael, I'm obviously thinking of you. Would you like to kick it off?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question, and obviously, given my background and interests, I certainly would advocate for making literature central to or I mean not central, but a robust part of a syllabus curriculum in civics education. And yeah, the novel, I teach Moby Dick, and people, my colleagues always told me, you can never teach Moby Dick, right? These kids today just can't read, they can't think through difficult stuff, it's too long, it's too crazy. But I did it and for many years I listened to that. I said, oh, we'll do Billy Budd, we'll do something shorter. I taught Moby Dick last year, and it was a great experience. The first step, though, and this speaks, I think, to your question, some of its larger philosophical implications or backgrounds. The first step is to motivate. I mean, students can do difficult things if they're motivated to do it, right? Even today, even with iPhones, even with AI and so forth. And so it begins with a sense that this is an old book. It's a book that has been found by generations of people to be transformative, to give them all kinds of insights into democracy, into the use of language, into religion, into the environment, and so forth. And then also to testify personally, like, this book blew my mind, and it can blow yours too, right? And to be able to say that forthrightly and communicate something of a sense of the preciousness and the value of spending time with this very difficult work that at the outset. So if someone's going to say at the outset, why should I read this book? There's no good answer to that, right? There's no way I can convince you, with you not having read Moby Dick, why it's so great, right? You have to take my word for it. You have to, in some ways, take that on trust. And we live in an environment, and this was one of the things that I was dissatisfied about English departments, where people became uncomfortable with the idea of great, right? The idea that there are great works of enduring value. Well, who's to say that Taylor Swift isn't as good as Moby Dick, or you know what I mean? Like these kinds of things really had, and you saw an erosion of the curriculum, a shallowness of it, and a moving of the curriculum really to the point where when I go and give talks in English departments, most students haven't read much before 1950, and in many cases 1990. Right, so there's a shallowness, and re-erecting a sense of the value of the tradition, of how it can transform us today, right? That is again, it's countercultural because that's not the ambience of our popular culture or our broader academic culture. So that's the first thing is believing there are great works of enduring value that have stood the test of time. Having literature as part of that, right, and fiction as I happen to think that the 19th century produced two truly radical literatures, the Russian and American literature, both of them involved in the process of nation building. And American writers, think about, in the 19th century, they think more seriously, more deeply, more experimentally, more strangely about democracy, about equality, about freedom. They are, and they all the major writers, Douglass, Whitman, Dickinson, and so forth, understand themselves to be engaged in the project of creating a democratic American literature, right? And so immediately you're engaged with questions that animate us in the civics community, in the project of civics education, but in surprising ways, right? In ways that continue to astonish. Emily Dickinson's conception of equality and Whitman's are totally different. Their forms are totally different. The forms of life to which they give rise and from which they arise from are completely different. Their attitudes towards religion. So I just think these works offer a profound resource for the aim of education for citizenship.
Tetyana, so you've talked about Augsburg as a place 51% migrants, people who are not necessarily, as it were, deeply immersed even in the German tradition. Is there any way for your kind of education that the concept of a canon would make sense or would be of value?
Of course it did. And of course there are texts also that unite all of us. So we don't need to start with Plato, but we can if you want. And we can mention a lot of these texts. But of course, what also important is that certain values, certain narratives are grounded also in social, in historical context. And it's important to know all these. So Peter established the Summer Institute of Civic Studies 2008-2009 together with colleagues. In 2015, Peter, Carol, and we moved this institute to Ukraine and made 2015 Summer Institute of Civic Studies in Ukraine. And we were thinking, can we take these books and texts that we read in US, can we read them in Ukraine? With different people but most from Eastern Europe. And we decided to start with a text, 2015, with a text from Miroslav Marinovich. It's a Ukrainian philosopher from Lviv who was the Gulag prisoner for his whole life and then a dissident, and then he, 2014 in Ukraine was a big revolution of dignity, the so-called revolution of dignity, and he was one of the philosophers talking there, and he wrote a lot of text about what does it mean to have a dignified civic life. And we started with Miroslav Marinovich and his text, and we noticed this is exactly what in this situation, in this context, spoke to people, right? So we need also kind of hooks, narratives, images, metaphors that are also embedded, rooted in a certain tradition, and then we can abstract them also and read Nussbaum if you want. Nothing against her, but we also need Miroslav Marinovich, and we need to read from each other, not only American and not only Russian, but also different literatures, and saying also. We had in Germany, we always read Theodor Adorno when I talk with my students. How not, right? How don't you talk about coming to terms with the past, or education for autonomy, education for democracy, education for maturity, without these things? And I noticed when American students come to Summer Institute, they have heard about the Adorno, but when they read Adorno, they understand probably more the German context, but they can also relate Adorno to their American context, which is super helpful. And I would also say the canon is literature, the canon is classical text. The canon are also sometimes speeches, political speeches, giving at the right time, at the right place. We can talk in American context about Martin Luther King. We can also talk about, in German context, we always read the speech of Weizsäcker. This was a German president from 1985, where he was talking about, it was 85, 40 years after the end of the Second World War, and he was talking at the 8th of May about the end of World War II in Germany, and he was taking this notion of guilt, German guilt towards the world, and transforming this into the notion of responsibility for the world. It's such a powerful speech, and it's not a canon text, but I would say in civics it might be an example of a canon text, a speech in the right place, in the right time, that actually captured our incentives, our motives, and transformed it in something useful. And the third and last one, probably also to the canon, I would say we need also to listen. Generous listening is here a key word. To have life stories that we gather together and to put them down because they are powerful. If I hear a life story of a Ukrainian woman that migrated to Germany, and I see this, I see what she went through, I understand her motivation. Just let me give an example. 2021, when the full-scale Russian war against Ukraine started, and a lot of people came also to Augsburg, to my city, to Germany, and we kind of talked with them and gathered all these stories and wrote them down to have them. There was one woman from Kharkiv who migrated together with her father. This woman was Ukrainian Jewish origin who said, I am married to a Ukrainian nationalist. I am a Jewish woman. My papa, with whom I also driving in the car, was saying like, I was fleeing from Germans to Russians as a Jew person. Now I am fleeing from Russians to German. What's going on? And I am fleeing together in the car with this, your Ukrainian husband, nationalist, that he called him. The world is on its crazy version. And to write and to understand this life story, it's also for me a text that could be a canon text. To think a little bit more in nuances and to think about our democracies as a very difficult but worthy enterprise.
So, Bryan, you have studied rhetoric from a long time back. Speeches are completely important for you, but you've now just founded a new center for civic thought. Will there be speeches as part of the canon there? What do you see as the question or the place of canonicity in what you're doing?
Yeah, the canon question is interesting. I think, look, we're pretty eclectic in the texts we choose. I mean, with three colleagues, a number of years ago, we taught a 2-semester sequence that we called the American Imagination. And we were very eclectic. I mean, it had poetry, speeches, sermons, treaties, newspaper articles, all sorts of things. I think the question of what to teach is partly a pedagogical question. It depends who you're teaching. I think it matters a lot that you try to figure out, that we all try to figure out where our students are coming from, what speaks to them. So often a speech can be useful for that reason, but then The truth is we're all products of a history. And one of our tendencies, along with our practicality, is presentism. One of the last remaining prejudices that's legitimate in our society is a prejudice against the past. And it's true that the past is filled with injustices, but it's also true that we're all products of it. And so I would say, if there's a tendency in our sources, it's that we emphasize primary texts of different kinds, that we don't shy away from texts that are long ago. We all know that traveling to different places is a way to expand your horizons and become less parochial as a person. Well, time travel does that to you too. And since we can't do it, we have to do it through books and speeches and sermons and all of those sorts of things. And I will say that I'm continuously surprised at the fact that the texts that I may feel are old hat and not very original choices on my part don't seem that way to students encountering them for the first time. So to read the Declaration of Independence slowly with a group of 17, 18-year-olds, or with a group of 67-year-olds who have never actually read the document and talked about it together, can be a transformative experience. Everything depends also on how it's discussed, and that's why the discussion part is so important. I guess a worry about canonicity, it would be a sense that the books are presented in a certain way, that they're presented as things that you are meant to imbibe and be shaped by in an ordinary sense, as those just information for you to learn. The truth is, these books should be provocations, they should be challenges, they should force you to rethink your life. And taught in that way, we found that, yes, very canonical texts, Plato's dialogues, still work for students, high school students in New Haven. They want to know why Socrates, having been unjustly convicted and sitting on death row in jail, when his friend comes by early in the morning to spring him out of jail and tells him he's going to be executed that day, Socrates decides not to take that chance. Antigone still wraps them up. They admire this young girl, and then as we get into the complications, they start to see both sides of that tragic situation. These texts still work, but there's no reason not to combine them with Audre Lorde. In our 2-week program, they're reading both sorts of sources, and so they're free from any doctrinaire point of view, and that's what we want. Again, the thought is that sort of intellectual freedom, which comes from hard work together with these books in the classroom, is a civic resource.
Terrific. Well, Tetyana reminded us that citizenship, when we talk about it, tends to be, and it really should be, I think, about democratic citizenship. But this means there is a presumption that there's something good about democracy. So if we do, as teachers, make a case for the instrumental, perhaps even the intrinsic value of democracy, how do we distinguish what we're doing from indoctrination? Tetyana, you've written about the problems of indoctrination. You've written about the bad tradition of indoctrination in a kind of what was imagined as a kind of radicality or radicalness in the early Soviet Union. And you've written perceptively about transformative learning and its critics, the way that this can become a kind of indoctrination. How do we both say something is good and start from that position without falling into the dangers of indoctrinating our students?
Oh, it's a big topic. Let me take just one side of that, and probably why democracy is good. I would say this is the only form of life who takes a person serious as a person, who respect human dignity as such. Just imagine a totalitarian regime. You are a small wheel in the system, and you can be anytime a collateral damage. And this is the main difference for me. between the democracy and any kind of authoritarian regimes. The value of a human being as such, the value of human dignity that cannot be overrode by anything else. Nothing can be put above. No idea can be put above a human being, whatever idea it would be. Let us take, because we are now in Eastern Europe, let us take socialism. Probably a wonderful idea, I don't know, but take Lenin, who said, all people who don't get it, I will just put them into gulags. He established gulags 1924 for all those people who don't get all these good ideas that he had. So just to put any kind of big something over a human being, it's for me an absolute no-go, and the system that protects us from that, in ideal world, and we can strive for ideals, it's democracy. So, but that has consequences if we break it down to education. Education means you cannot impose. You cannot transform into a vision, whatever valuable vision it could be. You cannot form and mold and shape people according to what you have in mind. Because who says that what you have in mind is the best version for everybody in this room? So, and this is the main difference between education and indoctrination. The indoctrination tries to mold and to shape. Indoctrination puts my ideas over yours. Indoctrination use methods that are instrumental in its way to lead somebody somewhere where I want to be. And you can say, yeah, education is always leading somewhere. That's the purpose of education. Paideia is actually leading in its etymology. Yes, but it's also showing the way and let the person decide where you go. It's also suggesting and proposing and discussing, as opposed to this is the way. And staying in my metaphors, of those of you who travel in the former Soviet Union, you saw the monuments of Lenin. There was a Lenin showing the way, and this is the only way. So any kind of pluralism is not given there. It's a culture of homogeneity, of homogenizing everyone in its thinking, in its action, homogenizing the way you need to go. And yeah, I think that I might go further into that, but that's where I probably stop for now.
Michael, do you want to take up the question of, obviously, if we say some works are great, the fear is we're now just indoctrinating students in saying there's only a certain kind of greatness. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I've thought a lot about this. An education that is not indoctrination is very difficult to do. I'll start by saying that because of some really innate human characteristics. We tend, confirmation bias, right? We tend to project what we already know, what we already believe, what we already value onto the text, right? That's just very natural. The most common experience for me as a teacher would have a student, I would say, what's in this passage? The student would raise that and say, oh, this person is saying X. And I would say, where do they say that? And they don't say that anywhere, right? It's just, we just assume it's there. So to me, the question of how to defeat indoctrination is really in fine-grained pedagogical habits and habits of mind. The first of which is close reading. Close reading, adhering closely enough to the language of the text that it defeats my tendency to project. I can't project as easily if I'm hewing so closely. The poet John Keats had this idea of negative capability, right? He said that Shakespeare's the greatest poet because he was able to basically erase himself, make himself a blank slate, and fully inhabit characters and forms of life that were different than him. I think that's also the task of an educator, right? And is to, in some ways, have that negative capability. To me, the best professor I ever had in my life was a woman who was vastly learned in poetry. But what she did in class was she would sit there and she would just perform befuddlement about what the text was, right? Like, I don't know what this means. And you can imagine being a young grad student, I'm coming in thinking, I already know everything, right? Of course, I'm ready to project my thin knowledge onto any surface that's available. Um, so, so that ignorance, right? That ignorance is very powerful. I just find that a very powerful tool. The other thing I'll say, and this is again to return to this sort of countercultural theme, and this gets to greatness. The main criteria our culture has for the greatness or goodness of a work is the criteria of relevance. How is it relevant to me? How does it connect with what I already am, what I've already experienced, what I already know, what I believe, what I value, right? I feel that that criteria of relevance, while it has its place, is not what we're going for in education or in civic education. Instead of saying, how can this text be a mirror from what I already am, right? How can it be a window into that which I do not already know, right? That I think is the task, and it's above all a task for me as the professor, right? It's very easy for me to use a work as an example of a belief I already hold when I teach Tocqueville or something like that, right? Um, so staying in that place of ignorance, right? Of openness, of porousness, of vulnerability, of that negative capability. I feel that if I'm there, if I'm able to lead and show the students, model that for students, then I feel that's a very barren ground for indoctrination to take root.
So, Bryan, you've written recently about the core value of liberal democracy is in its provision of a refuge, a kind of safe harbor from power. Does this bear on the indoctrination question? Do we have to provide our students with a safe harbor from the kind of power of the professor imposing a particular vision upon them? Does this bear on? I think your very profound idea that that liberalism is about protection from power.
And these are difficult questions because look, you can't have this kind of commitment to democracy and a pedagogical commitment to opening people's minds and having them figure things out for themselves and discover things they don't already know. So, the question is how these are combined best. I certainly think of universities as providing, again, time and space, so in that sense, a refuge for the difficult work of learning, figuring things out. I want to say this too. I think we're at a moment here, and certainly in this country and elsewhere, where some of the texts and issues about democracy are much more alive than they used to be. When I was coming up in the 90s, to read John Stuart Mill on liberty was kind of boring because we all sort of assumed something like that argument for liberty, and to read John Locke on consent was also a little bit boring. These weren't live texts for us, but today, some students anyway are really hearing, and some little part of them is wondering about the validity of theories that are much deeper challenges to liberal democracy, theories of racial hierarchy, of blood and soil nationalism, of the justified revolutionary violence. These are live considerations, at least for some of our students, and that means that there's a real set of conversations to have in that. But I find the pedagogical challenge to be how to have an open enough conversation that students can work their way through these issues in a sincere, legitimate way, not just a performative way for us. I hope they land somewhere close to liberal democracy, but you can't force it. And I find recently, at least what the approach I've been experimenting with, is to focus on the problems that, well, now I'm teaching a course on the Federalist Papers and that kind of post-revolutionary founding moment. And there it's been most helpful to focus on the fundamental problems that they were trying to address, practical problems, theoretical problems, rather than foregrounding the solutions first. And those problems are not easy to escape. And once you start seeing the world from that perspective, they needed to be a large republic because otherwise they would simply be conquered by their neighbors. But to be large meant a more indirect form of democracy, but to have that more indirect form of democracy posed challenges of its own. Once you start with the problems, you draw them into the thought in a certain way, and then they can take ownership either of the solutions in that text, or if they can think of better solutions, more power to them, but at least they're working their way. I think we have to avoid, especially with an idea of canonicity or certain texts, which I teach those texts and think they should be taught, but there's a way of teaching them in which it's like presumed that, of course, these would be the texts or these would be the answers you would come to. And it didn't seem that way in the moment in history. Everything was more contingent, as Joanne Freeman, one of our historians at Yale, always emphasizes. And so to bring students back into the problem and have them messily try to figure out solutions and have some faith that actually in the right kind of open environment, and if you have a pluralistic group of students, I guess I just have the faith that they're going to end up with some version, maybe a new version, of something like liberal democracy, because it does make sense. But if they come up with something better, more power to them.
I do now want to encourage people to come to the microphone. I hope we've been sufficiently controversial to provoke some questions. But while you're thinking and approaching, let me ask a somewhat related question to the previous string, and that is the relationship between appreciation and critique. Because clearly some part of teaching is about why we appreciate these texts. We present them with texts, whether we consider them canon texts or whether they're stories that we're gathering from our students themselves or from people in our community. But there's something in presenting them, that these are worthy of being presented. There's something to be appreciated. But then there's, of course, also the question of critique. So how do you get that balance? Michael, you've advocated for a greater role of aesthetics in the teaching of, literature and even the teaching of literature as civics education. Does that allow for a way to get at this balance, or maybe there isn't a balance? Maybe we should just be saying, learn to appreciate and you can critique in your own time, or no, criticism is where we start, and eventually you'll start to see the true beauty of these things.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, one thing that students and faculty are extremely good at and need no assistance with is critique, right? Like I've never had a class or colleagues or been to a conference where it's like, God, there's like no critique here. You know what I mean? Like they, where's the critique? That's not the problem, right? The appreciation is more salient just because that's not the resources that folks have right now. And I'll just echo something Bryan said, which is when he mentioned the experience I've had also. John Stuart Mill seems like totally fascinating now and like completely boring 20 years ago. But I feel like a lot of really basic elements of civic education have become enlivened in ways I couldn't have imagined earlier. I think of Hannah Arendt's critique of the concept of the human as being basically empty, right? The human, when someone is perceived as human, as she says, I'm paraphrasing it, they've lost everything that would enable us to treat them as human. Human became this kind of empty category. Whereas now, just with the AI and everything else, right, the human has become incredibly salient and has it's not an emptiness anymore. It's actually this full kind of category. And I think something's true with the aesthetic also, with judgment, right, the capacity to discern good from bad, to discern different kinds of qualities and values. That's no longer something that was just that one can just assume people are really good at anyway. It's actually become salient. And I've I got invited to give a talk at this AI conference in New York last year, and I'm surprised. I don't know anything about AI. I kind of hate AI, but they were all like, judgment is actually something that we are really like AI can't do it. You know what I mean? Like they don't have the capacity to discern. So I think a lot of these really sort of what has been presented for ever since I got in academia as a first generation, immigrant student, I was told that appreciation is something that's so old hat that everyone knows how to do, that we've really moved past it into critique. And that's been true my whole life, and I'm 50, you know what I mean? So I think renewing the capacity to appreciate and adding it, and, hopefully we'll get to a place where there'll be more of a balance, but I think that's where the need is, at any rate, right now, on the appreciation side rather than the critique side.
Great. I do want to hear the other you two on this, but let's get a couple of questions first. So please, and introduce yourself briefly.
Sure, thank you. Jeff Schulman of the American Council of Trustees and Alumni. We do a lot of work both promoting civics, but also broader sort of liberal education. And that sort of brings me to my question, right, which is that there seems to be a recognition, at least on this panel, right, that there's a major role for, I think, cultural heritage in civics education in some way, or at least, great texts. But what I'm wondering then is, what are sort of the criteria for picking those texts? And in particular, are we sort of taking a route that says, or do you think that the sort of route is that those should be maybe pieces of cultural heritage, I think a lot of great books, but also artwork that are somehow relevant to question, or particularly relevant, maybe more so than the others, to civics and democracy, or that might be chosen based on that relevance? I think of things like Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, Aristophanes' The Clouds, Copley's Paul Revere painting. Or is there value in a civics curriculum in cultural heritage purely for its own sake?
Bryan, I think that almost is for you.
Well, first of all, I'd say a lot of the foundational transformative texts that are taught in these sorts of programs are always relevant, actually. The reason that they keep being taught is not just out of some sense of cultural transmission or literacy. It's that they continue to provoke fundamental questions for human beings. Now, there are more specific things. And here, I'm particularly attracted lately to courses that are on the theme of self-government, the history of self-government. Somehow, that represents a set of challenges that are concrete and that students can still see in their local community, even in their university, but are also relevant to this nation and its history. And I worry that that thread, because you're kind of asking what the thread might be, that thread is being lost. My students, some of my students on the right tell me there's a debate now brewing about whether it's best to think of the nation and its history as an idea or as something based in land and heritage. Some of this is based on a couple of speeches that Vice President Vance gave. And I've been saying, well, if you read Lincoln, someone wanted me to mention Lincoln, I always do. If you read Lincoln, I think there's an alternative there, which is an experiment in self-government. Self-government not as an idea, actually, only, but as a practice, something that's never finished. So it's not an unfinished experiment because it's a progressive project meant to reach a certain end that we haven't gotten to. It's unfinished because it's a form of activity that is always unfinished. If you're governing yourselves, there's always work to do. And so that's an example of how a text, speech, a couple of Lincoln speeches, can present an idea that's missing, sort of a missing alternative in a contemporary version of a debate. And I think you can draw a through line through, if we're talking about American civic education, I mean, that'd be one through line that I would advocate, but not the only one that's possible.
Briefly?
I'll just say really quick. The question of cultural transmission, I think is not really the realistic one that education faces. It's more of cultural creation. The creation of a community in the classroom, in the educational space, and as opposed to reaffirming some putatively already existing community. And so, and that involves different criteria. Right, that involves different criteria, and I totally agree with what Bryan said. Works that can help you think, right? Works that are good to think with. It can expand your sensorium, right? One of the criteria for discerning that is often the famous test of time, right? I think that's not trivial, right? Works that have for centuries and millennia had that capacity to always be new in some mysterious sense. That's not a trivial capacity of all or most works. It's only a few.
Tetyana.
Thank you.
And probably I will try to connect your first question, Josh, about appreciation and critique, and also the question about who determines and how cultural and canon should be. Michael said a keyword for me, and the keyword was this question of judgment and the power of judgment. And for me, the judgment, not only for me, but I actually refer to Kant, in terms of we need to have this ability to jump between the particular and the universal, back and forth, to have the reflective judgment and determining judgment, both. So we need to know, this is mine, I can relate to this, it's my particular. It's particular of my neighbor or my foreigner or my enemy, whoever is it. But I also able to jump to a kind of universal thinking and to see the universal idea in every particular thing that is around me. And so if the text does this, if it's introduces us to some particular context, but also has this big idea, universal idea behind this, I can always fight for a certain cause, civic cause, democratic cause, but I can fight for a certain group. In my case, I fight now for Ukrainians in German, but I always have this universal thing in mind, that it's actually fight for human dignity, justice, better world. And to be able to have a text that tells us a story, a concrete story of a concrete person in concrete life situations, and then extract something from that that would help also in another situation. I remember when 2014, I was in Kyiv in Ukraine talking with people who were just organizing this revolution of dignity. And we read together Paulo Freire, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And they were looking at me like, this about us. I'm like, not quite. It was written 1970. Yeah, but it's all about us. And that's, I remember when we were doing this back and forth jumping. So that's, I wouldn't say there is only that or only that. And it's our capacity of interpretation, of hermeneutics, if you want, to have the appreciation for the universal, and also critique if it's too particular and I cannot relate to that.
Thank you.
I think we have one more question, and we'll have a lightning round of responses.
I hate to do this for the lightning round. Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel Davison-Humphreys. I'm Senior Director of Civic Learning at the Bill of Rights Institute. And I wanted to ask a question about how you might have to have adjusted your curriculum for the current moment and the current student. So I'm reflecting on all of the comments today and all the connections I see to great thinkers of the past. And, you know, Oakeshot's quote that we're the inheritors of a conversation, right? So the young people today, though, for a variety of reasons, seem to have a wider gap between their core knowledge and the resource, the the resources being drawn on in those great texts. So the connections that they're able to make to other texts seems to be widening. There seems to be a greater gap. I am a great advocate for these things, and I had civic curriculums in a variety of different contexts. So I've seen civic curriculums. I went to a community college, studied social science, then I went to St. John's College, studied great books, and then I went to Georgetown and R1. So I've seen how civic learning is approached in a variety of communities, but I wonder how you may have had to change your curriculum or recast your curriculum in light of this wider gap. And I'm sorry it had to be a lightning round.
Okay, so this is the great challenge. About 30 seconds each to answer a pretty challenging question.
Yeah, super quick, and a really great and important question. The first thing I would say about that is I think it is not possible to teach the books in terms of a conversation. They just don't know, right? But that said, that's never which isn't to say the conversation can't get started once they've begun, but you got to begin somewhere. But in teaching, great works of literature and philosophy, the context is the student's life, right? That is your life, and those are works that can speak to their life, that can find places in their life, in their perception, in their experience, rearrange it, give it new value, and that should be a test. That's a criteria, though. If a work is only valuable or intelligible in its relation to some other work, that's not going to work in this moment, in my view. It's got to be a work. The test has to be, this can blow your mind right now. You know what I mean?
Bryan.
I find myself going more slowly. Really, so just slow reading with a group turns out to be incredibly powerful. And also you can start to recover some of the, like one part of the conversation at a time. So an example that comes to mind is in our Citizens, Thinkers, Writers program, we always read King's letter from Birmingham jail, and he mentions Socrates 3 times. So you can work in that direction. You don't always have to work chronologically. You can say, well, who is this? Why is he mentioning him? Let's go look. And curiosity is still powerful. And then, and he mentions Gandhi. And it turns out Gandhi translated Plato's Apology of Socrates while he was in South Africa. So there's a fascinating story, just by reading the letter slowly. So you can always recover parts again and start.
Tetyana.
And probably just taking just another round and using 30 seconds, I would say if I connect to these life stories as a source of civics, then I would say probably it's also about time in civics now to turn more about materiality of our being. I think we're missing this a lot, that everything about us is also grounded in the materiality. I notice this when migration is always losing of materiality. And how important is it when people tell their stories, that they start to tell, look, what I took with me from my country was an embroidered shirt that my mom made to me, and that connected to that idea, and that idea. Just to finish with this, like in our world, the question of materiality, the question of what surrounds me, what are the spaces that I am in, what this tree reminds me of, can actually grounded us back in some very, very valuable ideas that are actually not abstract anymore. We started today with a sort of, if it's abstract, it's far away from me. How to make it material and sensible and tactile in our world.
Well, I think we out of time, so I'm sorry to have to cut off the last question, but thank you very much, each of you, for giving us, I think, a lot to think about.